There
There we
we
go.
are. Okay, greetings, one and all. Thank you for joining us today with an interview with Luke Kemp, author of Goliath, The History and Future of Societal Collapse. Uh, it's a massive and very scholarly work and deals with the emergence of what we typically think of as civilization. But Luke has a little different view of how civilized those were and defines the emergence of empires as Goliaths with some very uncivil characteristics that we'll get into and talk about the history of what the human condition was like before empires and the encouraging implications of that information that is brought forward. So we'll be spending some time looking at the issue of collapse, what it means, how likely it is, and most importantly, what we might be able to do about it uh, at the present time. So we'll start off with some questions. I think, Sarah, you have the first question. Well, why don't we first introduce the fact that this webinar series has been initiated by our climate declaration, and we share it with our colleagues in the degrowth movement, of which both Sarah and I are founding members, and a number of other organizations such as Engineers for Social Responsibility and the Wise Response Society, all New Zealand based. So we'll be sharing this interview with those organizations and as many others as express interest. So that's a little bit of introduction I should have done.
Mm.
Now, Sarah, you have the first question for Luke. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Jack. And thank you so much for joining us, Luke. Just such a privilege to have you with us. Just huge respect for your work. And just by way of a very brief introduction to me, I am somewhat unusually, I'm a midwife by training and have actually worked in Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. So when I heard you talking about the, comparison of the early civilizations in Egypt and Papua New Guinea, I was really interested in that. And I'm also interested in epidemiology and reproductive trends going forward,
Mhm.
as well as the whole degrowth movement, which I've worked with Jack closely about with education and awareness raising. And really interested in your work from a New Zealand context. So what it means for a, geologically remote area and what we
Mhm.
might learn from looking backwards. So just a little bit of context there.
Mhm.
And yeah, to get us started, just before we look at the history of societal collapse, tell us a bit more about what you found out about the human condition before empires emerged.
So when we tend to think about the human condition, we think about how humans evolved. And all the way from roughly 300,000 years ago, when we first emerged as a species, Homo sapiens sapiens, through to roughly 11,700 years ago, we lived in a period of recurrent ice ages known as the Paleolithic. And when we think about human nature, it's during this period is where we would have developed most of our evolutionary inclinations, things that evolution taught us to do unless culture compels us not to. This time looked very, very different in terms of governance structures. We have no strong signs of wealth inequality during this period, nor signs of hierarchy. Most people out there will have certain myths and assumptions about how humans looked during this period. And often we think that we were just small ragtag groups of roving hunter-gatherers, mainly existing as small family units. And that wasn't quite the case. It's true from archaeological evidence and studies of existing nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers. It does seem that most of the time we're in small bands of roughly 20 to 40 people, but sometimes this could grow up to 200 people. Interestingly, they weren't usually just family members. Even amongst existing nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers today, only roughly 10% of a group is closely blood related. Often you have people who don't speak the same language and come from far-flung areas. And while one individual may live in a small group momentarily, they're probably going to know thousands of people over the course of their lives because they're constantly moving across groups. This is something which makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective.
One of the reasons we survive while other hominids like Denisovans, Neanderthals, Floriensis all die out is because we had much more genetic diversity. We were much better at moving across groups, which encourage both more cultural evolution, the uptake of new cultural ideas, technologies, etc., but also meant we had more genetic diversity, which meant we could get through tougher times. But while we were often existing in small groups, we lived in much bigger societies. And people don't realize these societies could be vast. We have, for instance, examples all the way from 120,000 years ago of areas of exchanged musical instruments, stone tools, and culture and genes, all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast of Africa. Similarly, in Europe, during I think roughly 42,000 years ago, we had the Aurignacian culture, so shared cave art, figurines, stone tools, all the way from Spain through to Siberia. So I call these in the book fluid civilizations. The idea being that we were very good at cooperating without violence, without hierarchy, in relatively equal terms, and doing it at a very vast scale. But the key was it's not like modern day governments or states as we think of them, where you have a very clear hierarchy and clear fixed borders. Instead, these are fluid. People were constantly moving across different groups. There was still a social order across groups, but there were no states, there were no kings, no lords. And this ended up being a winning strategy for surviving the Paleolithic. And it's worth noting that the other big assumption people have here is that humans by nature are very violent, and that if we don't have some kind of overarching authority, we tend to devolve into mass panic and civil disobedience. This permeates both all the kind of literature on collapse, Mad Max being a great example, but also many of our assumptions. Most people do prepping, they'll go and stockpile beans and ammunition. But when you look at the Paleolithic, that doesn't really hold up. The best archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that we probably had a lethal violence rate of maybe 1 to 2%. In other words, for every person born, for every 100 people born, roughly one would die at the hands of another human being, which at a global level is pretty similar to the modern world. And it's far lower than the numbers you probably heard from people like Steven Pinker, who usually say this was closer to 15 or even 25%. Which makes a lot of sense. It's kind of hard to have these big shared cultural trade zones if you're constantly killing each other. No one likes trading across a war zone. And apart from that, we don't really seem to have any evidence that we were prone to mass panic when disaster struck, which again, evolutionarily makes sense. If every time we had a drought or a volcanic eruption, people freaked out, that's an evolutionary recipe for extinction. So overall, this is a picture which is not just supported better by archaeology and anthropology, but it just makes sense. We had to be well adapted, interconnected, and fairly peaceful in order to survive these incredibly brutal ice ages, which were optimal down to -5 degrees Celsius on average across the world, and roughly a third of the world was covered by ice sheets. But in short, our evolutionary picture, our human nature, is one that should give us a lot of hope. But things do eventually change.
Yeah, but I think that is definitely for me one of the most significant parts of this narrative that's coming out now is to counter this false narrative that somehow we are Hobbesian, brutish and selfish. And I just was so relieved to come to, more even back to Daniel Quinn and his, levers and takers talking about our origins, what makes us human. We are social and collaborative and egalitarian for 95% of our ancestors, right? So,
Exactly.
mm,
Yeah, a couple of follow-up questions to that, Luke. Do we have any sense of why people congregated in large, densely populated settlements at this time? I mean,
Hmm.
why did they come together and stay together for such long periods?
Yeah, so we don't have much signs of large sedentary gatherings until roughly the Upper Paleolithic, so roughly 40,000 years ago, and this is just confined to Europe, and then in the Holocene. So once you get 11,700 BCE, or years ago, I should say, this period of new climatic stability and warmth. That's when you start to see much larger gatherings of people. You do have likely during the Paleolithic these kind of larger congregations. So even modern day nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers will regularly come together for certain rituals. The reason we expect that they do this is once again mainly for genetic diversity. It's an opportunity to meet people from lots of different groups and often to find a partner. So these are often just a really good way of encouraging movement across groups once again. And we have a large number of examples, particularly from, I think the most well studied is some of the Central African Republic nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers.
Mhm.
Note that these aren't like sedentary settlements. It's not like people are sitting together in a village for 6 months. It's usually maybe a week or two, a couple of days, where they come together for ritual and disperse once again. We don't get more sedentary living and the build-up of villages and cities until you get the Holocene.
Mhm.
And that seems to be for a different set of reasons, although it probably does at least initially start in part because of this desire to come together into larger groups, share ideas, and potentially make new relations.
Mhm. Yeah, I know another question I have, and I suspect there's not a lot of evidence available, but do we have any inclination of how people's relationship with the natural world changed over these periods?
During the Paleolithic, not so much. We have enough evidence in the Paleolithic to have a decent idea of what our lifestyles were like, how much we moved, genetic diversity, and even our governance structure. We have far less in terms of how people fought.
Mhm.
We have only things like cave art. We have examples of the use of red ochre, basically a red substance that people would have put in their bodies. But people didn't have writing, for instance. So they weren't jotting down, here's how I
Yeah.
envision my relationship with nature. It is worth noting that the best analogs we have, nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers, particularly peoples like the Khoisan people, the Kalahari Desert, who appear to have more or less an undisrupted genetic legacy of roughly 200,000 years. And as far as we can tell archaeologically, there haven't been any huge changes to their material culture during that period. They tend to have a very strong sense of reciprocity and animism. So basically, they think that the environment is full of spirit, is full of some kind of life substance,
Mhm.
but also they see themselves as essentially stewards of the land and they have a reciprocal nature with the land that gives to them. And this seems to be something which is pretty common across lots of nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups. Probably the best study we have on something related to this, which is the emergence of spiritual beliefs, is led by Frank Marlowe. Long story short, they basically did a big cross-cultural study looking at multiple different groups, including hunter-gatherers. They tried to do this very funky technique called a phylogenetic tree, which I won't explain here, but essentially involves more or less trying to look at in a tree, linguistically, genetically, where a certain group would lie, and hence how far back you can until you get to the root of common ancestor. They more or less said that it seems like most nomadic egalitarian groups and our earliest ancestors probably all had some notion of animism, some notion that the wider environment, wider world, was filled with spirit.
Mm.
Hence, it probably gives us some inclination that they had something of more of a stewardship relationship to the environment. But again, bear in mind that's something we're very unsure about, and it's quite
Sure,
uncertain right now.
sure, yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, a very, very different picture of what we typically think of, and to believe that we have such an egalitarian past. And I mean, obviously, we wouldn't be here if we weren't good at cooperating,
Mm.
with each other. Um, so how did the empires evolve then? What we've come to think of as civilization, but what you've pointed out has some very uncivil characteristics. How
Mm.
did they
Mm.
emerge? What are those characteristics, and how did life change for people with the emergence of these Goliaths, as you call them?
Yeah. So during this period, it's worth noting the big thing that changes is not that people become civilized. The key change when you look across the world, where we think about the earliest civilizations, so Uruk in Mesopotamia, the Shah dynasty in China, or the first dynasty of Egypt, in every case, the big difference here is that you start to go from the egalitarianism, a world of equals, towards a social structure of domination, where a small group or a small number of individuals essentially have status that are ranked above everyone else and then maintain that dominance hierarchy through violence or the threat of it. I'd call these Goliaths because I think that's much more accurate. They tend to be very big, they rely upon violence, and they're often surprisingly fragile. Why do they emerge? There's commonalities across the world where we look at where these Goliaths emerge. One of them tends to be agriculture, but it's not as simple as just having a surplus. For instance, when you look across the world, there's at least 10 different areas that independently had agricultural food production. But only a number of these, 5 in particular, developed the first states and the first Goliaths. The example often used here is comparing Egypt to New Guinea because they both had agriculture at the same time, roughly 7,000 years ago. And yet in the case of New Guinea, they never developed pharaohs, they never built pyramids. The key difference here seems to be what they're growing. So the idea we often get told is that once you have a surplus, you can start to pay people to do things aside from farming and growing food. You can pay them to become bureaucrats or rulers. But when you look at New Guinea and Egypt, that's not the key difference. They both had surpluses. Instead, in the case of New Guinea, they grew bananas, yam, and taro. In the case of taro and yam, they are essentially invisible while you grow them. You grow them underground. Once you dig them up, they only last around 6 months. Bananas last only around a month. By comparison, wheat, which was grown in Egypt, lasts decades. You can store it for an incredibly long period of time. And it advertises itself when it's ready to be harvested by having very tall stalks. It's what I call a lootable resource. It's easily seen, stolen, and stored. And when you look across the world, every area that develops a Goliath tends to have a lootable resource, whether it be wheat, rice, corn. And in the case of some hunter-gatherers who do become more hierarchical, more violent, and they adopt patriarchy and slavery, they tend to have access to fish, in particular smoked fish, which becomes a kind of proto-lootable resource. And so lootable resources also become a way of explaining that. Why do you have hunter-gatherers who start to look like Goliaths? It's because of lootable resources. But that's not the entire picture. A second big factor here is monopolizable weapons. Weapons that can be easily owned and controlled by a small group. In the case of the Near East, so both the First Dynasty of Egypt and Uruk, and in China with the Shah dynasty, you don't see the first states popping up until you get the introduction of handheld bronze axes and swords. And across the world during colonization, we see numerous times where once you start to introduce muskets and gunpowder firearms, you start to see local groups and indigenous peoples often developing hierarchies as well, like in the case of the Kingdom of Hawaii, which springs up shortly after gunpowder weapons are introduced into the island. And last but not least, the big final factor is caged land. In almost every single one of these cases, people had very limited exit options. They couldn't move easily, which meant if you faced a growing autocracy or growing power structure, it wasn't as easy to get out of the way. In the case of Mesopotamia, it in Greek means the land between 2 rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Egypt, buffer between the Red Sea and the Nile. And in general, agriculture keeps you tethered to the land. So these big 3 factors are what I call Goliath fuel. They're the environmental conditions that lead to the emergence of these dominance hierarchies. And once you start thinking of it like this, that it's really about a small group using monopolizable weapons to steal resources from the larger mass of people, suddenly it starts to look more like organized crime than it does look like a story of great art and progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole idea of civilization seems to get turned upside down here. And so is the concept of civilization a con? And what makes the con work if it is?
Yeah, in general, I struggle with the book insofar as most of the terminology we have is, of course, molded by history. We all know the old trope of history is written by the victors, but most of us don't really take that to its logical conclusion of course, a whole bunch of the ideas and concepts handed down to us are shaped by the victors of history, states, empires, etc. And civilization, I think, is a term of propaganda. When you look at the root, the Latin root is civilitas, which means has connotations of good political conduct, wisdom, virtue, etc. When you look at the first states, they don't tend to exhibit those characteristics in particular. Instead, the commonalities are they're all dominance hierarchies, they're all preceded by warfare, they all have elements of patriarchy, and they all have slavery. Those aren't things I usually tend to think of as civilized behavior. And today, building things like atomic weapons don't require civilization, they don't require civilized conduct. They require dominance hierarchies and obedience. And you'll notice this throughout the book, actually, is not just terms like Goliath and civilization, but even, I think, the very term collapse. We have some often apocalyptic connotations, which I think are more about history being written by the 1% than they are about reality. So why do we have these particular stories about the past? Well, one is that states and hierarchies have been really good at selecting certain types of stories that justify supremacy and domination. So when you look at the very earliest states, they all tend to have some kind of story which justifies why there's a ruler and why everyone else should listen to them. In the case of Egypt, after the Zhou dynasty, we have the idea of the mandate of heaven. And interestingly, this happens essentially after a coup where one ruling family takes over the dynasty. And they seem to use the mandate of heaven as a way to justify it. The mandate of heaven being this idea of if the emperor does their job well, they are going to reflect the order of the cosmos. And hence, everything works well, and there's a reason to have the emperor on top. However, if they lose the mandate of heaven, if they become too corrupt and don't reflect the heavens anymore, things will start to fall apart. In the case of Cahokia, one of the very earliest cities of North America, we have a whole bunch of suggestions that there were probably a bunch of priests who justified their rule by claiming to control the weather. And of course, in Egypt and Uruk, we have a whole bunch of kings who claim they were either gods or the reflections of gods or the ambassadors of gods. And of course, in all these cases, we know that this is frankly bullshit. There's no evidence that any of these people were actually representing gods or were gods themselves. But they become very good ways of justifying why one person should be in charge. And it's worth noting that even the idea of a Hobbesian world, so we mentioned Hobbes earlier, the 17th century philosopher who had this idea that if we don't have authority structures, the life of people would be nasty, cruel, brutish, and short. Hobbes is not the only person to have this idea that we need to have rulers, otherwise we'll devolve into chaos. It's something which happens across many cultures, all of which tend to have dominance hierarchies. So in the Buddhist scripture of the Digha Nikaya, there's this old story of there was once chaos until eventually people elected the most charismatic, good-looking person to lead them, and they gave them a grain of rice as a kind of edible tax, which is a perfect example of actually kind of what happens, but in this case, a lot of a nicer story than probably what actually happens in reality. There's the Mahabharata, which is from the first millennium BCE, Vedic scripture, which basically talks once again about how if you don't have rulers, you tend to have a situation where more or less it's like big fish eat little fish. In chaos, everyone just eats each other. In general, it became a really good way of justifying a dominance hierarchy, is saying, well, if we're not in charge, if we don't have rulers, then things will turn into a complete scramble, a violent scramble for resources. And interestingly, even collapse is a way of justifying the hierarchy as well. One of my favorite examples from the book is the Admonitions of Ipwa, which is from the first intermediate period, basically the collapse between the old Egyptian kingdom and the middle Egyptian kingdom. And this is a set of poems and stories penned after the collapse by a bunch of scribes employed, of course, by the pharaoh. Keep that in mind. And interestingly, it, of course, talks about civil war, bloodshed, cannibalism, mass famine, but it actually spends less time talking about those things, which, by the way, we have very little archaeological evidence for, but spends even more time talking about how it's so terrible that suddenly the servants can speak back to their masters and that there's common ownership of corn, and that suddenly people who couldn't own a sarcophagus before have both a roof over their heads and can have a sarcophagus. They're much more worried about the inversion of the social order than they are about anything else.
Mm.
And the reason they probably connect all this to mass famine, civil war, is because it becomes once again a really good way of saying, keep the social order, otherwise things will end up going to hell. So I think we're surrounded by a whole bunch of stories which tend to buttress and reinforce hierarchy. And that becomes a really good way of legitimizing the organized crime racket.
Mm.
Yeah,
We
and
could
we
talk,
certainly
talk.
have the perpetual progress narrative now, which justifies, ongoing growth and exponential extraction and on and on. Yeah.
It's
One
worth
of
noting
the,
that, oh, please.
I was just going to say, one of the things too that we
Yeah.
often hear is that, there was lots of starvation and people suffered in the past, and we needed this highly organized system in order to ensure that people had basic needs met like good food. But
Mm.
uh, the evidence that you have summarized indicates that that's not quite the case in terms of people's health in pre and post empires.
Yeah, so a lot of people, particularly economists, have often assumed that, well, we have these big states, we have rulers, they were probably doing a bunch of good things like providing public goods, organizing people during disaster, and in general, what's called reducing transaction costs, basically making it easy to do collective action, to do cool things at scale by reducing the cost of coordinating people. And maybe there's some element of truth to this, but interestingly, when you actually look historically, most of the things like irrigation systems, for instance, seem to occur before you get the first states. And there's a large number of examples I have in the book, say, for instance, Tiwanaku, one of the earliest cities of South America, Monte Alban, one of the earliest cities and states in Mesoamerica, Gene, pretty much the earliest city in East Africa, all of which they actually start as egalitarian arrangements. They build monuments, they build big irrigation systems, often even cities, whilst maintaining a certain level of egalitarianism. It isn't until you start to see the first signs of growing wealth inequality and also of having a structural elite that you start to see the first signs of inequality. Sorry, you start to see the first signs of instability. And it seems like in these cases, people are pretty adept at doing collective action without having elites, without having rulers. The rulers came later and probably took the credit. And in general, I haven't seen any strong evidence that we can't do good things without having, which require rulers all the time. Another great example here is the Harappan, which existed roughly 2600 BC, so roughly 4600 years ago in the Indus Valley in Pakistan. And they're roughly concurrent with some of the earliest states in both Egypt and Mesopotamia. Here we have a collection of different interconnected cities, the largest of which, Mohenjo-daro, is roughly 40,000 people. They have built up bathhouses, big communal halls. They even have plumbing, underground plumbing, which was just insane for that period. And yet we have no signs of there being a ruler. Archaeologists for a long time speculated they must have had some kind of ruling class, but we essentially have no evidence at all of that. They may have had some other kind of governance mechanism for arranging people, but we don't know. And as far as we can tell, it was egalitarian.
But what about the impact on health? I mean, did so-called civilization actually make people healthier?
No, this is something which people like Jared Diamond and Yuval Harari actually get right in this case, is the shift towards intensified agriculture was a wrecking ball to human health. This ranges from things like human height. So human height is a good overall biophysical indicator for general health. People who encounter famine, for instance, or have lots of disease or just have less calories and less protein tend to be substantially shorter. And of course, vice versa. And height decreases by, depending upon where in the world, but usually by a couple of inches across the world as you get the intensification and adoption of agriculture. You also start to see more dental caries, weaker bones. You start to see more stress injuries, particularly to the knees, for instance. And on top of that, you start to see the emergence of what we sometimes call diseases of civilization. Most big infectious diseases, things like smallpox, yellow fever, influenza, all of these are pretty recent because they require large densities of both people, but also usually people with animals. They're zoonotic infections. In the case of smallpox, it takes roughly a group of, I think, 200,000 people for for smallpox not to die out very quickly, for it to basically mutate within that population and keep going. So you probably don't get that until a couple of thousand years ago, basically. So most of the great terrors and plagues upon the earth have been things that didn't start until a couple of thousand years ago, once you get the large clustering of people in the first cities. In general, it was a wrecking ball to human health, but it's worthwhile remembering that this was a pretty slow wrecking ball. We often think of this as the agricultural revolution, but it was revolutionary in its consequences, but not in its pace. In general, it took roughly 3,000 years to go from more intensive agriculture to the very first states. And often it took thousands of years just to simply double the amount of wheat or barley being grown in a set of fields. So this was a very slow, stop-start, staccato process.
Mhm. One of the very interesting, many interesting bits in your book was the report that there was actually evidence of more violence and death by violence leading up to the development of these Goliaths rather than during periods of so-called collapse.
Yeah, so
Another indication of the very different health implications for what we've come to understand as civilization.
exactly. So at least the best evidence we have skeletally of in the Near East suggests that you have relatively low rates of violence until you get what's called the Chalcolithic period, which is essentially more or less as you get the emergence of the very first states. Violence starts to go up. Once this empires are actually established and they kind of have something, not quite a monopoly on violence, but they're controlling violence more effectively, violence goes back down and then it increases again during collapse. And the way I like to think of it is that in many ways, the violence you see during collapse is actually the violence of state creation. This is never a war of all against all, as Hobbes once said. You don't see, even in the modern world, situations which everyone tries to kill each other. Even the very worst cases, for instance, the Rwandan genocide, which was unnaturally kind of large scale, even that, when you look at the criminal records afterwards, only roughly 3% of the population seems to be involved in violent activity. The median age is 31, and I think it was something like 90% were men. And likewise, when we look at modern day failed states or to the past, in almost all these cases, it's small groups of armed young men, usually who are employed by the state, trying to recreate a new empire, a new power structure, a new Goliath. So the violence we see in collapse is actually the violence of state formation. It's about trying to create a new power structure.
Mm.
Mhm.
And relevant to this, I think, which I found really interesting too, is looking at the communities that actually arise after disasters, and this is obviously much more recent after climate disasters and things like that. So often there's examples of incredible cohesiveness and people coming together and peer support networks. And, I think, is that relevant to post-collapse as well, that people actually did congregate and help each other when there were, yeah, I mean, I guess it's speculative, but yeah.
Yeah, quite frequently. So we have this entire group of literature called disaster risk management, which essentially studies how do people behave in the wake of a disaster, whether it's an
Yes.
earthquake, a tsunami, even things like bombing campaigns and terrorist attacks. And there's pretty clear consensus across the body of literature that mass panic is largely a myth, and people are pretty good at self-organizing in a fairly egalitarian, decent kind of way in the wake of disasters.
Mhm.
One of my personal favorite examples is what's called boat lift. So boat lift was the largest maritime evacuation in world history, even a bit bigger than the evacuation of Dunkirk. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Coast Guard puts out a call of, we need to shuttle people away from Ground Zero on Manhattan Island across the Hudson River. Roughly 500,000 people got moved in less than the space of a day. And that was just by random people just heeding that call and using their dinghies, their small fishing boats, etc., to move people across the island, to move people across the river.
Mm.
And that's in general how people tend to react when it comes to periods of crisis.
Mm.
It's not that we're all perfect. There's definitely things like panic buying, for instance. And again, there are definitely groups who try to make an opportunity out of this and forge a new state and often turn to violence. But that's definitely not how most people interact. And if you're looking for a really good uplifting take on this, I'd recommend a book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise
Yeah,
Built in Hell.
that's
Yeah,
the
and she
one.
just, I mean, exactly. And first of all, beautiful writing, just so
Yep,
poetic, but also goes really in depth in terms of how you often have people remembering these terrible natural disasters as some of the best periods of their life because it
absolutely.
gives them a newfound sense of community, of belonging, of connection that they didn't have otherwise. And
Mm,
that once again points towards us, actually not being that bad, including when you peel off authority structures. Actually, sometimes we're even better.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, one of in terms of your description of the Goliaths, you talk about their evolution over
Yep.
time and how these key characteristics that you've identified evolve as well. Where are we now?
Yeah, so a lot of the book is about Goliath evolution, as I call it. It's hard to mistake the trajectory that we went from having a couple of pixels on the world map being states, Uruk, First Dynasty of Egypt, to today, where suddenly today we have essentially every single piece of land across Earth is owned by a state, either individually or collectively, except for actually one very small piece of land called Bir Tawal, which is basically between Sudan and Egypt, and neither country wants to claim it. But apart from that, basically everything is claimed by a state. So it's a huge expansion of empires, of states across the world. And wherever you see states and empires pop up, they tend to reoccur, reemerge even if they collapse, and grow bigger and bigger. So from 3000 BCE to roughly 600 BCE, so from the very first states in Egypt through to classical Greece, the biggest empire we had was roughly 1.4 million square kilometers. For some comparison, Egypt is roughly 1 million square kilometers. So the very biggest empire for the first 3,600 years of human history is only slightly bigger than modern day Egypt. Then suddenly we get the emergence of far bigger empires. You get Rome and the Han Dynasty, which are roughly somewhere in the ballpark of 6 to 7 million square kilometers. By 1200, you get the Mongol Empire, which is 24 million square kilometers. And then eventually we get the British Empire, which is 36 million square kilometers. And it's an empire in which the sun literally never sets. It spans almost every time zone across the world. There's a really clear trend here of empires increasing their size, but also their ability to control their citizens. And in general, this has been an evolutionary process where empires that have a larger number of citizens, bigger armies, and of course can mobilize more resources, have tended to conquer others and tended to last longer. And hence they tend to pass on their attributes to other ones. A great example is Rome. We don't remember Rome because it was the best for its citizens. If you want to see women being rounded up and sold into slavery or hundreds of people getting put to crucifixion, you can go to ISIS or you can go to Rome, your choice. Rome wasn't particularly good for its citizens, but it was incredible as a military juggernaut. It expanded from one city 5,000-fold into an entire empire which covered all of Western Europe. And that's the reason why I remember it and why we have a whole bunch of Roman institutions today, including things like the Senate. Our property rights regimes are based upon the Roman notions of fructus abusus, so the right to the fruits of, abusus, the right to destroy, and uses, the right to use. Our entire property regimes are built upon Rome in some ways as well. Emergency powers, also Rome. So this is all an evolutionary story of bigger empires with bigger militaries which control more people, tend to persist and pass on their attributes. And over time, we've had a lot of changes, including things like the adoption of new technologies. So that big jump from 1.4 million square kilometers empires to suddenly 6 or 7 million square kilometers, that coincides with Iron Age weapons, bigger bureaucracies, and monotheistic religions. So over time, states and empires have found new combinations of things, including religions, including new technologies and weapons, to grow bigger and bigger. And in general, the biggest changes have been the discovery of new sources of Goliath fuel. So we started with grain. We then, through colonial empires, started to find new ways of more intensely producing status resources and grain. So things like slave plantations. And then eventually we got fossil fuels, the ultimate kind of lootable resource, which is far more energy dense than grain is. And today we have, of course, grain, fossil fuels, but also increasingly data, another type of lootable resource. We're also seeing changes in lootable weapons, so monopolized weapons over time. So I mentioned we went from Bronze to Iron Age weapons, and that saw a big leap in the size of empires. Likewise, the emergence of colonial empires, that was largely due to large innovations in gunpowder-based weapons, both cannons as well as muskets, and seafaring technology as well. And last but not least, to cage land. We went from having to rely upon geography for caging to increasingly big walls in cities, and then eventually to mass surveillance systems, which of course we have today. And so today we inherit all of those systems together. We have borders, mass surveillance systems. We have new monopolized weapons in the form of nuclear weapons and killer robots. And of course, we have the new resources of fossil fuels and data.
One of the things we haven't talked about yet is, given during the Paleolithic period, the egalitarian cooperative kind of organization, self-organizing that people did.
Mm.
What are the characteristics of those people who took on the leadership role, and what are the consequences of those dynamics?
When it comes to leadership or often trying to gain status in a group, we refer to two different strategies. One is prestige, where essentially you show the rest of the group how you can give them benefits. And there's lots of examples in nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers of what we call task-based leadership. So an individual is good at a particular thing, like, for example, hunting, and they'll lead the group on the hunt. But that won't really spill over into the rest of life. So they'll help lead a group during the hunt, but then thereafter, they don't get more resources, they don't get preferential access to politics, they definitely don't dominate the rest of the group. There's a second way of trying to get more status, and that is through domination, essentially by imposing force or costs upon a wider group. And you do have examples of this being attempted in nomadic egalitarian groups. So we do have examples of usually men, actually in the original research here, always men, trying to dominate the wider group through usually threat of force. They're dealt with quite differently. They tend to be met with what we call counter-dominant strategies, either ridicule, ostracism, being kicked out of the group, or in the very worst cases, an in-group execution, which essentially means that for most of human history, if you try to dominate the group, that earned you not a place in the history books, but an early grave. But of course, when we look across written history, the history books, we see a very different story. Genghis Khan, Napoleon, Alexander the Great, these are all men who developed an enormous amount of status because of their ability to wreak havoc on everyone else, to starve and kill enormous numbers of people. So you see a switch from prestige through to domination. And it's worthwhile noting here that all of us want status. This is a universal desire across humans, but it's not equally shared. In general, men seem to want status more. And in general, men are much more likely to pursue status through domination. On top of that, people who want status through domination and are more comfortable in using violence tend to be people who are higher ranked in the dark triad. So psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, three antisocial personality traits. And we see that in the modern world as well. Across the average population, roughly 1% of men would pass the clinical threshold for psychopathy. For women, it's actually roughly 0.2, so it's 1/5 of men. In boardrooms and CEOs, amongst boardrooms and executive suites and parliaments, it rises to 3 to 21%. There's a pretty big range, but in general, there's no disputing that it is far larger in leadership positions than it is amongst the general populace. So what we see with the emergence of Goliaths is not just simply this change towards Goliath fuel and little resources. It's also a change where suddenly some of our psychological traits that were previously selected against start to be selected for. So you start to have social situations where we're more or less kind of selecting for the worst of us. And unfortunately, this seems to pay off for them. When you look across the world, there's a bottleneck in the Y chromosome in roughly 8,000 to 4,000 BCE. And essentially, the best explanation for that is that a small number of men start to monopolize reproduction. And it doesn't take much to think about how most kings and emperors throughout world history have wanted to keep harems, for instance. And that's one of the reasons why status is sought for, is it does seem to incur a reproductive benefit.
Interesting. I'm just reminded, your comment about ridicule being one of the counter dominance strategies and the importance of satirist in our own culture today. I mean, we've got interesting examples of interactions between the power elite and our satirists.
Yeah, and also I just, again, just have to think of the examples I know in my own life of, really admirable leaders who are de-centered leaders. They lead from the back, from the side, and very different than the centered, ego driven, status seeking, but because there can be incredible examples, I think, of leadership that is with a very different emphasis, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the key thing for me is that you can certainly have leaders who, once again, are very good at particular tasks. Even, for instance, military leaders. It doesn't mean you have to worship them as a god and give them 100 times more resources than everyone else. And that's something I've always found a bit strange in the typical telling of civilization, is that we had these great people who helped to build the civilizations, but you can do good things for everyone else and not demand a harem and palaces and complete control of the means of violence. That's something which I equate more with tyrants rather than leaders.
Yeah, and there's also the issue of how those leaders use information and technology and knowledge that was developed by the general population, and just sort of capitalize it or make a little tweak in it, and suddenly they're off on a billionaire trajectory.
Totally. I mean, a great example today is AI. We tend to think of AI as being this product of a couple of lone geniuses across the world. And of course, these systems are built upon the mass theft of everyone's data. They're actually forms of collective intelligence built from all of us, but we tend to pin them on a couple of people like Sam Altman, Darren Modi, who interestingly aren't even involved in actually building the models in the first place.
Sahra, I think you had another question about where we go from today.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think just painting the picture of what you put together now, and how our, you can really track the evolution of this Goliath from its sort of smaller roots, and now it's bigger and going from the material world to the data, surveillance world, and so our situation is unprecedented, and we've got ecological and climatic threats as well. So yeah, where do we go from here? And yeah, I mean, I'll just let you respond. Of course, we can take it in different directions, so lots to talk about.
Yeah, where do we go? So in the book, I explicitly don't try to make any numerical predictions about the future. I don't try to put a date on doomsday. That's for a good reason of we just can't do forecasting very well. When we've actually tried to measure how good people are doing predictions, in general, most of us suck. The very best approach is what's called super forecasters, where you get a group of preternaturally good individuals who are really good at forecasting. You get them together in a big group, you have them share information and deliberate, and then you essentially take the average across them and you tweak it ever so slightly using machine learning algorithm. These groups, this is an approach that tends to win all the biggest intelligence agencies tournaments, but even then, they have very little accuracy once you go beyond a year. Once you go beyond a year, they start to lose most of their reliability. And they tend to be used for questions like, who's going to win the next election? Not for these really big, complex questions like, will society collapse? So while I'm pretty pessimistic about our ability to actually put a date on doomsday, I think what we can do, and what I try to do in the book, is to point towards what are the underlying dynamics which tend to occur over and over again across history, and how do we think these are going to play out in the longer term future. In the book, I point towards how, in general, wealth inequality tends to increase unless you have a great leveler. This is based upon a colleague of mine at Stanford, Walter Shardo, and his work, The Great Leveler, where he basically empirically shows that, in general, unless you have a revolution, mass mobilization warfare, a pandemic, or a state collapse, you tend to have increasing wealth inequality. And I also then show that, in general, growing wealth inequality tends to make the society overall more concentrated in power, which also makes it more vulnerable. And I won't go too in depth here, it's something you can read in the book, but essentially this seems to be one of the key drivers of societal collapse across empires in world history. And today we see the same trend occurring. During the world wars, we had the Great Compression, so a combination of both the destruction of old money and the rise of welfare democracies meant that we had a period of surprisingly large levels of wealth equality. That starts to slowly reverse, and by the 1980s, it's really ticking up. In 1980, the top 1% globally held roughly 25% of wealth. Today, it's roughly 40%. And we start to see all the different impacts that one would expect of growing wealth inequality, things like the rise of the far right, increasing polarization, declining trust in public institutions, growing levels of social political violence, and on top of all that, democratic backsliding. And all these things, including also corruption, have pretty good empirical relationships to growing wealth inequality. So that gives me some fear, but I do think the big difference here is that while we have growing wealth inequality, states today are actually much more resilient in some ways. As mentioned, they're a product of Goliath evolution, and most states throughout history didn't even have police forces. Today, we have police forces plus intelligence agencies plus mass surveillance systems. So in some ways, I'm actually less worried about internal fracture due to inequality. But what I'm more worried about is how our systems of inequality are breeding new, unprecedented risks, what we often call existential or catastrophic risk. Things like climate change, nuclear weapons, advanced AI systems, engineered pandemics. And interestingly, underneath all those is once again power concentration and growing wealth inequality. If you look at nuclear stockpiles, roughly 87% of stockpiles held by two countries, Russia and the US. In terms of private companies, roughly 24 companies are responsible for upgrading, maintaining, and creating those weapons. And the same holds true for AI as well. It's only really three labs, Anthropic, DeepMind, OpenAI, who are at the forefront, and climate change as well. Roughly 80% of emissions comes from 10 countries combined, if you count the EU as one. So in general, all these things tend to be really concentrated and built on inequality. And unfortunately, I don't see that changing. And I think we're just going to keep on creating more and more risks if we stay in this Goliath structure. In a very simple way, you can think of it like this. If you have improving technology and arms races, where are you going to go in the long run? Over the space of decades or centuries, what's going to happen? And similarly, if you are constantly racing for new resources and you're relying upon technology to always fix the problems of environmental destruction, in the long run of decades or centuries, do you really think technology and a plucky technofix is always going to save the day? I don't think so. So I do think that in the long term, unfortunately, the most likely outcome is going to be what I call self-termination, essentially global societal collapse or worse. I'm not sure if that'll take decades to play out or centuries, but that seems to be the most likely default trajectory. The other one I talk about, which I think is more likely in the short term, is that we do find ways to persist. The global Goliath struggles on, but we find the world becoming increasingly unequal and states becoming increasingly predatory and reliant more upon things like mass surveillance and autocracy. In many ways, you can think about it as just simply the world returning back to the historical average. Throughout most of history, states have been brutally unequal, autocratic, and predatory. We've just experienced a really brief, beautiful, flourishing moment where states have actually been a bit more inclusive and much better for their citizens. But that seems to be slowly reversing, particularly across the OECD. That's what I call Silicon Goliath, essentially a world of autocracy, but also even more powerful mass surveillance systems. And the least likely scenario going to the long term is somehow we find a way to destroy Goliath. We find a way to re-democratize most of the institutions, to level power structures, and in the process to hopefully reduce existential risk. That is something which I think is unfortunately very unlikely, but it's technically not implausible. We know we can do all these things, and we're not even trying right now, which does give me hope that if we did try, things might be able to work out pretty well. But those are the kind of three big trajectories going forward that I foresee.
Yeah.
Mm.
Look, are there any examples historically of people, if the urge for freedom and equality is part of our nature, um, are there examples in the past where people use those instincts to thwart Goliaths?
Hmm. Yeah,
And
so
how did they do it?
yeah, there's a couple of interesting ones
Collective
here. So
struggle. Mm.
indeed.
Mm.
So Peter Turchin and Dan Hoyer, two colleagues of mine, they're kind of the big pioneers of structural demographic theory, one of the biggest theories in collapse. They point towards several historical case studies where a society has been on the path towards instability, growing levels of wealth inequality, and then they have a series of reforms which seems to reverse it, at least temporarily. And so they go through a few of these. The two big ones that stand out in my mind is the Gilded Age in the US. So that gets reversed not just due to the world wars, but also before that, you start to get the introduction of much more ambitious legislation around unions, for instance, and much larger unionization rates. You start to see the rise of welfare democracies, and of course, the New Deal that we all know about. And some of these relate to the world wars and some aren't. There's also, for instance, in the interbellum period, so between World War I and World War II in Sweden, you seem to have a pretty peaceful, benevolent leveling process where both, again, unions, but also reforms in parliament, which I think encourage greater union representation in parliament, seem to once again tip the scales towards equality. And another one that always springs to mind, of course, is ancient Athens. There's some debate, but it seems like there was essentially some kind of revolution of sorts against autocracy, which led to the movement towards this sortition lottery-based democratic system they had, granted only for roughly 15 to 25% of the male population, nonetheless. And during that time, you don't just have democracy staying in place for a long period of time, but it also seems to more or less keep inequality roughly in check. That's also paired with another interesting strategy here, which is, well, I think it's called the triarchy. Basically, if you were sufficiently rich, you had to maintain a trireme, a warship in the Athenian navy. And encouraging the rich people to basically expend a whole bunch of their money and trying to compete at who could have the bigger, cooler warship meant that they ended up actually using much of their money, and hence they couldn't more or less save it and create and get more money. So it ended up being a way to actually keep a check on wealth inequality. Now, apart from Athens, all these examples tend to be short-lived. They tend to be reforms that eventually get reversed. Athens is the only one that seems to be a bit more long-lasting, and even in the case of Athens, of course, it is eventually conquered by the Macedonian Empire. So we do have a couple of examples where it seems like counter-dominance and reform seems to tilt towards away from inequality. And we do have some very interesting examples where you have things where they're closer to societal collapse, but they seem to be driven by counter dominance concerns. One of the most interesting stories I found while reading the book is that of North America prior to European invasion. So most people, when they think of North America, tend to think that prior to European arrival, it was basically just nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers. That isn't quite true. There were several different groups that were hierarchical farmers and even hierarchical city-states across the US. We have Cahokia on the outskirts of modern-day St. Louis, I should say, which had roughly 200 mounds. It was basically a city organized like a mine city almost, with these big flat-topped earthen pyramids organized around a grand plaza. They practiced things like human sacrifice, often sacrificing dozens of people at a time. And all of these different societies, including Cahokia, and there's also others like hierarchical farmers in the US Southwest, like the Beloans, who also built these great sandstone structures, and the Hugum in modern-day Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, interestingly, is actually named after them. The Europeans, when they arrived, saw their remains and said, we want to build a phoenix from the ashes of this old civilization. They too built great flat-topped earthen pyramids and have ball courts. In all these cases, they all collapsed roughly the same period, so what's called during the Little Ice Age, but they had very different stories of why they collapsed. So in almost all the cases, they remember these as periods of revolution. The Vloans have this story of a great gambler, that a god who's really good at gambling comes to Earth and swindles everyone out of their property and out of their children, until eventually the people enter the lining of a group of gods and overthrow the evil gambler. In the Who case, the Hugum, there's a story about there being an evil priest class who increasingly maligns and tries to kill their cultural hero, Elder Brother, until eventually Elder Brother aligns the people and overthrows them in a great rebellion. And the case of Cahokia, it's interesting they have literally no oral tradition. There's no story of this city of 15,000 people. And instead, after Cahokia collapses, people just seem to avoid the area for roughly 100, 200 years afterwards. It becomes known as the vacant quarter. Eventually, it is reoccupied, but again, there's that long period where people just seem to avoid it, like they want to leave a bad memory to rot in the swamps of the Mississippi. So all of these seem to suggest that people sometimes are just walking away from dominance hierarchies, and the way they remember them suggests that there was a really strong sense of counter-dominance. We don't want to be in this situation being ruled by extractive elites, and let's not do this again. They become cautionary tales. So there are many cases, but unfortunately, if you're looking for cases where you've had really large-scale reform without having collapse, and reform that has lasted, unfortunately, there's surprisingly and disappointingly few.
And I guess, like, for me, what comes to mind too is sort of thinking, in a way, it feels like this so-called empire has become so unsustainable, and there are so many, multiple existential threats that part of me thinks I want it to collapse. And what can we build in the ruins? What can we pull out of the ashes of that if people survive? And is there a way of evolving and adapting those maladaptive, behaviors and dominance hierarchies? Can we look at what's happened and say never again? Can we adapt smaller, again, more egalitarian? And I guess that's where, for us here in New Zealand, we sort of think, is there a way of seeing what's happening elsewhere and actually, learning? Probably not, in my mind, I don't see much chance of kind of a voluntary counter-dominance process. But if there is a collapse, we don't have supply chains anymore, and we don't have the kind of structures that are ongoing. Can we actually potentially change, being a bit more protected and far away? But yeah, these are the questions that we're holding here. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're looking for refuges from global catastrophe, then New Zealand is pretty much the best place you can be. If you have, for instance, a nuclear war, most of the effects of nuclear winter end up being clustered around the Northern Hemisphere, in short, because that's where most of the burning cities are. Both Australia and New Zealand get off much lighter. They tend to still have more sunlight, better growing conditions. If you're looking at a pandemic, then as we saw with COVID-19, in general, you'll have more forewarning and you'll be a bit more buffered away from the rest of the world just because your islands sit in the middle of the Pacific. Even interesting when it comes to climate change. I mean, New Zealand tends to rank pretty high in terms of the kind of, well, pretty low, I should say, in terms of the vulnerability indexes, just because high capacity plus just not as many threats as, say, for instance, Australia would face. And in general, even those who are worried about an AI apocalypse, people like Peter Thiel and Sam Altman, I mean, funnily enough, they have a deal that if things go south, they themselves will head south as well. They'll have a deal to jump on Peter Thiel's private jet and jet down to New Zealand. So New Zealand is one of the few places which probably does have a good status as a global catastrophe refuge of sorts.
Yes, but only if we change our paradigm, only if we
Indeed.
adapt psychologically, right? And I guess this is where I get really, that's that psychological adaptation that I'm most interested in, really, yeah. And how to.
And this, yeah.
Luke,
No, exactly.
you've talked about using citizens' assemblies and polis type consensus decision making as a way of changing the power balance, by removing special interests from decision making, essentially, is what that does. It gets ordinary people to identify what the priorities are, and
Yeah.
they're quite different from those that the elite set. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about that I don't think you have addressed, or if you have, I've missed it. And many of the suggestions that you made, such as citizens' assemblies and things like data unions for controlling that other lootable asset of data, um, clearly those are worthwhile things. The question in my mind is how effective they can be, because the dominance hierarchy is so pervasive and so seemingly powerful.
Yeah.
Can it really make a difference? And what do you think about a somewhat different strategy that deals with focusing on preparing for collapse as the priority, given its likelihood, as you suggest? And well, what's your take on that as an approach? I mean, it's kind of accepting that that we're going to collapse. It in
Yeah.
that sense, it doesn't feel quite right, but at the same time, there's a certain realism to it. It would seem.
Mm. Yeah, so there's both the approach of trying to essentially reform the current system and avert collapse, and the approach of accepting the collapse as most likely course and trying to build something better in its wake. I'd say there's also a third path here, which is essentially waiting for a sufficiently big crisis, what I like to think of as a Goldilocks shock, that you
Yes.
have the ability to transform institutions, but
Yeah.
it's not big enough to really cause a genuine global catastrophe. I tend to go usually for those two and less for preparing for collapse. But that being said, I think we should be spreading our resources across all three strategies. In terms of preparing for collapse, well, I think it has a lot of use. The problems I see here is, one, collapse is really hard to control, and it's hard to tell how bad this will be. When I think about collapse, this could range all the way from a slow deterioration of global industrial systems due to declining energy ratio. So as fossil fuels become more and more costly to dig up out of the ground, we just find that suddenly things don't work as much. We're investing less in the public infrastructure. There's more discontent, instability. That's, think of a bit of a slower, more drawn out, and I'd say also more benevolent process in comparison to something like we get 4 or 5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. We also get an enormous amount of geopolitical conflict, eventually culminating in nuclear war. And you have a combination of both nuclear war followed by a descent, or in this case, a rising into enormous amounts of warming. That's something which is going to kill far greater numbers of people. The impact ecologically and socially is going to be very, very different to the other scenario. So when we think about collapse, there's just so many different ways it could unfold. And in general, when power structures start to fall apart, one of the things that reliably happens, which is bad, is, as mentioned, you tend to have groups who try to build a new hierarchy. You tend to get more violence. In the past, those battles were usually fought with iron weapons, bronze weapons, muskets, cannons. Today, we have nuclear weapons and increasingly killer robots. And also just most people are reliant upon industrialized supply chains at this stage. So if they fail, lots of people unfortunately are going to lose their lives. Hence, I'm not convinced that having a global catastrophe is going to be something which A, is kind of morally defensible in terms of the number of people who are going to be lost, and B, is something that actually is going to work out well. I mean, one of the other things to note here is that often with collapses, sometimes it does result in more democratic societies emerging, like in the case of classical Greece. In many other cases, you get even more autocratic regimes popping up in the aftermath. So unless we have really, really good preparation and can very reliably say that we're going to have something better emerge from the ashes of the global Goliath, I would be wary. In terms of the middle approach, I think that's actually maybe a sweet spot where we can pretty much guarantee there's going to be pretty big shocks coming in the next century, whether that be due to huge social displacement from emerging technologies, from accelerating climate change, and having in place a backup system that when politics starts to really struggle, people can turn to as a new vision for organizing society. And to be frank, that could be the same kind of vision you have for the kind of society you want post-collapse as well. But in short, I think we should do all of them. It's just for me, the risks entailed with having a collapse are so great that I wouldn't want to put my eggs in that basket.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, well, the idea of preparing for a collapse, in a sense, provides possible models for
Yeah.
post-collapse.
Yeah.
And one of the other strategies that, again, I may have missed in any of your interviews or writing is the idea of non-cooperation with the dominant hierarchy. You know, if you think of what the Danes did in the Second World War in resisting the Nazis, you know, it was a good example of disobeying, of confusing the enemy, of simply not participating. I mean, your suggestion of one of the most important things we can do is don't be a dick. It's the idea of not cooperating with the system. The whole nonviolence strategic thinking is about the powers that weaker parties can have to deal with much more powerful parties. And I forget whether I mentioned to you in some of our exchanges about the Einstein Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
No.
It's based on the work of Gene Sharp, who did a considerable amount of work on nonviolent tactics to deal with helping the less powerful deal with the injustices of the more powerful. And I think he identified something like 400 different tactics. But the thing is, they need to be put into a particular strategy for a particular situation. And so it really takes the same kind of intense planning and preparation and training as a military operation to do it properly. And there are examples of how it's evolved spontaneously, as with the Danes. And interestingly, just as an aside, one of the things the Israelis have consistently done is pick out any spokesperson in the Palestinian movement that talked about nonviolent resistance because they appreciate the power, potential power of it. And so I'm just wondering whether that idea of non-participation, of nonviolent resistance in a planned way, whether you have any thoughts about how effective or useful that might be as one of the arrows in the quiver, to use a bad analogy.
No, I think it's actually quite a good analogy. You could also say one of the stones in the slingshot as well, if you wanted to lean into the David versus Goliath analogy.
That's right.
There you go. Perfect. We need lots of stones.
Precisely. So throughout the book, you can see the influence of one of my favorite scholars, James C. Scott. And Jim had a book called Weapons of the Weak, where he talks about exactly this, how sometimes just simply doing things like dragging your feet, disobeying orders in a pretty indirect way, even things like what's called, work rule to strike, which is basically where people would strike by literally following the manual, the workbook manual, as closely as possible, to the extent where things just didn't work. And I think those are all really valuable. They are ways of avoiding direct confrontation, but of still slowing the machine in some kind of very appreciable way. In terms of nonviolent resistance, I think that's been absolutely critical in having any kind of progress about history. So one of the things I found most astounding in writing this book was that from the intensification of agriculture through to the Industrial Revolution, you don't have much by way of human progress. You don't have much by way of improving health, for instance. Human height for men is roughly 170 centimeters throughout most of this time. It changes, interestingly, collapses often result in people getting taller and healthier. Similarly, I think women were roughly 163 centimeters as well, in a similar trajectory. When it comes to real wages, no big difference, despite huge changes in technology like the adoption of windmills, water mills, the iron plow. In general, a peasant 8,000 years ago in Egypt was about as well off as a peasant 1600 living in England. What changes, interestingly, is not the Industrial Revolution. things actually get worse in Britain. People get shorter, life expectancy goes down. And of course, we have the horrible tragedies of kids dying in mine collapses and working 14 hours a day. What changes is once you start to get non-violent resistance and sometimes violent resistance, mainly in the forms of unionists, suffragettes, abolitionists, anarchists, basically organized social movements, usually working through non-violence, working through things like strikes, organizing communities. It's when you get that, suddenly you start to get shared prosperity. You get things like sanitation, mass literacy, all the things that we associate with modern social progress. And I think that's going to be a really important part going forward. And it's noticeable that both here in the UK and elsewhere across the world, particularly in places like both Australia and the US, there's been a really big crackdown on protest movements. There's been increasingly passing of legislation, which makes it more difficult to be involved in civil disobedience and protest. And I think that's in large part because they're scared. They know it'll probably work if you get enough people onto the streets.
And that's the difficulty, isn't it? When we need vision and something that mobilizes people towards a new paradigm. And I guess that's where, just one of my final questions to you really more personally is like, what can we do? It's like the educating and the awareness raising and the offering of alternatives, like peer support networks as a alternative to relying on authorities. And how can we create more sense of collaboration instead of fear, which is such a driver. And so I guess that's that thing, is how do we band together more? Is it just through like reaching for a different paradigm and inspiration? I guess it's everything we can do to connect across the divide and be less polarized. That's why Audrey Tang's work is so inspiring to me,
Yeah.
using tools to be more cohesive. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, what can we do? It depends upon who you are and, of course, what power and tools you have at your disposal. In general, I think people should try to be democratic, both in terms of, voting, trying to vote and encourage others to vote on the basis of what party actually has good plans to address things like climate change and nuclear weapons. These should be really high on our political priority list. But also in your own conduct. Don't be a Goliath in terms of your workplace. Often when we think about democracy, weirdly, we're like, well, if we vote every 4 years, that's democracy. But if you work 9 to 5 in an autocracy, like a corporation, that's okay. That's also democracy. Well, not really. Democracy is more or less inclusive political settings, and that applies equally to a family or a corporation as much as a government. In general, I think people should try to organize and mobilize as much as possible. I would love to see some kind of movement which brings together people who are concerned about things ranging from AI through to climate change, and positions that help to unify, both in many ways, the populist left and the populist right. I actually think that's weirdly one of the things that gives me hope going into the future, is that when you look at a Trump supporter and a Bernie Sanders supporter, they're different in many ways, but their base narrative of the world is actually surprisingly similar. It's that we need to have more democratic representation of the average person, and that the world, unfortunately, is not representative of their interests because of corrupt elites. And there's a kernel of truth there. And I think both those groups would support things like citizen assemblies and citizens' juries. And similarly, when you look at things like AI, there's really strong majorities of people across the US and other countries who just don't want to build more powerful AI systems. They don't want to build machines that are there primarily to take their jobs, and in the very worst case, if things go wrong, take their lives. So we do actually have, I think, popular support on our side. This is what the typical tale of money versus people. And this is going to come down to organizing and mobilizing. And I wish I had like a clearer blueprint of how to do that, but a combination of A, I spent a lot of time trying to understand history and didn't have as much time to put out an entire blueprint, but also B, I don't quite like the idea of actually trying to have a utopian blueprint of how do we get from A to B, because I don't think that's how the world works. We kind of have to react. We have to play things in a fairly organic manner. And whenever we've had people promising, here's one roadmap to utopia, it ends horribly. I think we can have some general ideas of what we need to do, things like deliberative democracy, leveling power, wealth caps. And how we reach those goals across different countries is probably going to vary a little bit. But across every single one, it's going to involve with building community and mobilizing politically. One thing I'll note, and this is, I think, slightly more grim, is there's a much bigger question hanging over all of this of even if we do get non-Goliath, more democratic societies in a subset of countries like New Zealand, how do we make sure they aren't outcompeted by bigger empires? And this has been kind of the history for, sorry, kind of the story of history in many ways is nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers. There's only a few small pockets around the world because most of them get eaten by empires. And that's something which we have to address eventually as well, is how do you make sure in many ways to kind of win the race, to make sure that good can compete? And this is the second big thing is I think we need to find new ways of using technology to not just do democracy at scale, but also to escape things like arms races. I will say the one thing that gives me a lot of hope here is while I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to move away from that self-determination pathway, is that we're not really trying right now. And I feel like if we even put a small amount of resources towards trying to do things like democracy at scale or escape arms races, humans are capable of incredible things. I mean, I have a small little thing called a smartphone, which can literally locate where I am on the entire global map, bouncing a signal off a satellite. It can tell me using information gathered from all across the world, how I get from here to a different country, for instance, as well as transferring money from one bank account to another across those countries. It's incredible. If we put our collective ability towards things like solving arms races and doing democracy at scale, I think we could do incredible things. But once again, the problem is that we aren't.
Yeah, well, and I guess, Luke, I mean, one of the things that I am just observing as well is that there is an increasing sense of concern. Like we're talking about the meta crisis now. You know, we've got a conference happening on the meta crisis. And even in psychology, you know, my partner did a presentation on the meta crisis and how it affects their work. And so as that kind of concern increases, then also perhaps there's more motivation to actually really mobilizing, you know, in across different populations and different cohorts, and that sort of vision of the peer support organizations. And so there's potential through crisis, I think. And, you know, there's always opportunity when disaster is looming. And I guess that's in a way, especially when I work with younger people, it's like people are looking at the future with a very different level of concern, I think, than 30, 40 years ago even.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me with the meta crisis is it certainly includes issues like the planetary boundaries. And I've been meaning to ask you whether you're familiar with the work of the group in Exeter, the University of Exeter, on planetary solvency.
Yeah, of course. I did some of the initial work with them. So Sandy Trust, all the Medicine others,
interestingly, you know, their projections are pretty dire in terms of you know, what's likely to emerge in the next couple of decades. And the data that, as I understand it, from the planetary boundaries and ecological overshoot research, which is a measure of global carrying capacity, is that we're already exceeding our global carrying capacity by a significant amount. And it raises the issue of just how much longer our current system can function, regardless of what other disasters may occur with respect to AI or killer robots or even war. And to me, it seems like a much larger concern, because if we are disrupting the biosphere to such an extent that all of the basic services that we receive from the biosphere are unraveling and are going into a state change, that not a lot else matters, you know, if that happens. And there doesn't seem to me, the planetary solvency group and the planetary boundaries group certainly seem to be sounding the alarm. And it seems to be penetrating a little bit into the more mainstream, but still far from an accepted levels of risk understanding. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, the planetary boundary folks have been saying the IPCC is significantly underestimating systemic risks, you know,
Mm.
from climate and related other aspects. Um, what's your take on how serious the sort of ecological uh, challenges that we face are and how it fits in with all of these other risks
Mm.
that you've identified?
Yeah, so my background initially is actually in climate change. I lectured climate change science and policy back at the Australian National University. And interestingly, it was in the process of doing a lecture on kind of what's some ways forward when it comes to climate change, both in terms of social movements, but also technological fixes, in particular geoengineering. That ended up being my gateway drug into thinking about all the other things that go wrong. Thinking about how geoengineering go wrong, I also started thinking about nuclear war, etc. But I've always been first and foremost usually concerned about global ecological crisis. And I've done some of the work, as you mentioned, around the planetary solvency framework with people like Sandy Trust and Tim Lenton. And when it comes to planetary boundaries, things don't look great. So we have roughly 6 of 9 planetary boundaries. So things like biosphere integrity, novel entities, atmospheric loading of ozone, climate change, all passing into the higher risk territory. And note, this is kind of it's always a lot of uncertainty here, and we don't know where the tipping points will be or how long it'll take for the really bad effects to kick in. But in general, I think for most of these, we're underestimating how bad they could be. A lot of this is due to just really bad modeling. The original models around climate damages were just, to be frank, terrible. They were economic models which couldn't even forecast a recession, let alone how bad climate change will be in 2050. There were models where you couldn't even kill anyone. Population was an exogenous variable being put into the model. I'm not sure how you can model catastrophe if you can't even kill anyone in the model. And the kind of models where even if you turned up climate damages as high as possible, you could collapse things, but only momentarily before they rebounded immediately because they had an assumption that labor productivity would be essentially the highest it had been throughout history. So even after a collapse, people would be working harder than they ever have. Anyway, long story short, I think we're being lulled into a false sense of security because our models are so overly optimistic. And I do think that this is a really big challenge. When I look at what we often talk about as the Anthropocene, a world in which humans become the dominant driver of global systems change, it's part of a much longer story. We often talk about the Great Acceleration, that since the 1950s, we've had a huge acceleration of all of our environmental impacts. In the book, I put forward the case that when we think about inequality and the rise of Goliaths, the key things we look at, things like differences in housing sizes, grand burials, they all tend to be acts of conspicuous consumption. They're wasteful uses of energy. And that's a way for one person to gain more status over other. It's a status competition mechanism. And even today, when we look across the world, it's pretty clear that global ecological crises are more down to a subset of individuals than everyone in general. Of course, everyone does have an impact on the earth, but for instance, roughly, what is it, the top 1% have more emissions than the bottom 66% of humanity. There was another study which suggested that roughly a third of planetary degradation, when you look across 5 planetary boundaries, can be attributed just to the top 33% of wealth holders in the world. So there's a really strong story of inequality here. And once again, it's tied to this underlying issue of status competition, that when people want status, they do conspicuous consumption, they do wasteful uses of energy. And unless you find a way to address that, unless you can address races for resources and races for status in the long term, I think we are likely to undermine our planetary carrying capacity, our planetary life support system in the long term. So unfortunately, that makes things also very difficult. I think it's not just simply about democratically controlling technology and solving arms races, doing democracy at scale, but it's also making sure we do that whilst also solving things like races for resources and races for status. But this is the thing, we kind of have to think about what are the root causes behind all this, because if we don't, if we just address nuclear weapons and AI, but not planetary boundaries, we're still doomed in the long term.
Which
Yeah,
really takes us to, what does it do to our humanity? What is the paradigm that we want to belong to in terms of what is satisfying and what is worth
Mm,
living for? Yeah, sorry, Jack.
yeah. I was just going to say one of the reasons I asked the question earlier about the Paleolithic settlements, people's responses or connection with nature, because
mm.
I'm reminded of Gilgamesh, the one of the earliest
Yeah,
forms
the
of
epic Gilgamesh.
literature,
Yeah.
and within there's a story of how a sacred forest was being considered to be cut down to use the wood for making warships. And there was a big debate within the kingdom of whether this should happen or not.
Mm.
And they of course cut the forest down and built the warships. So it was, the struggle of how we deal with natural systems
Mm.
is very old. And
Yeah.
we've made mistakes for a long time. Uh, and it seems to me that reconnecting somehow with our reliance on nature is an important element in moving forward.
And we will be humbled as a species,
Mm.
to return to the space, the state of reverence and honoring of the sacred, even if it takes us to our knees. I
Mm.
really do
Mm.
feel like that, when we look at the deep future, you've looked at the deep past, but I think
Mm.
there's a big lesson in this and it will be a humbling one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Oh,
thank you.
certainly. No worries. I
Mm,
mean, one of the things that gives me a bit of sad hope in some ways is that when you look at people, even though there are things like status desires, there's the darker angels of our nature, as I call them. In general, even people who want status and to try to dominate others, ultimately what they want is human connection. And even those people, they like being out in nature. It's pretty strong that almost everyone has a biophilic response. They,
mm,
when they're out in nature, tend to have lower stress hormones, lower cortisol, and they tend to be happier.
mm,
And one of the most surprising, dumbfounding things I found when researching this book was when you look at happiness and you do comparisons between nomadic egalitarian groups like the Hadza in Tanzania against some of the richest, in general, pretty happy people, like people in Spain, for instance, or in the US, the Hadza are happier. And I think part of that is due to both their social connections and their environmental connections as well. I think in a weird way where we often will talk about the great simplification, for instance, and there's almost a bit of kind of doom monger around this. I think in many ways, a return to simpler ways of life
mm,
with
mm,
more genuine social connection and more connection to our surroundings
mm.
will lose some things, but in many ways, I think most people will be much happier.
Absolutely. What do we
That's
belong to? We
that
belong to each other and we belong to the earth, it's a big process of learning. Thank you, Jack. Mm,
yeah, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Yeah, and that's what the the alternative, to working toward an alternative to collapse is
mm,
establishing exactly that sort of environment. Anyway,
mm.
Luke, this has been fantastic. Many, many thanks
Thank you
for
so
your
much. Mm.
not only your scholarship and your dedication to these critical issues, but your generosity with your time. Um,
Yes,
Of
and the
course.
and
integrity
for our
of your
viewers,
heart.
I just want to remind viewers that there are many, many more fascinating um, bits of information and ideas and concepts of the book. So I highly recommend the book as well. Luke,
Very, very
thanks.
inspiring.
Um,
Yeah.
all good
Oh, thank you
wishes
so much,
to
both of you.
the
Mm.
continuing effort, and good to know you're there.
We have a
No
very,
worries.
very solid base of support here in New Zealand, Luke. So
Yeah.
thank you again, and just hugely grateful for all the work that you do. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, for the kind words, and also for the work that you two do. And for everyone who's watching this as well. I mean, all of you are most certainly doing just as much work as I am in trying to build a better world.
Yeah.
So
All the
thank
best.
you.
Okay. All the best. Keep well.
Excellent. Adios.
Mm.